Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yasmin Daher, and I would like to ask you please to all stay on mute if possible. And if you have any questions, we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Today's presentation, Introduction to the Modern Heritage, 1925-1970, will be presented by Naji Assi, an architect that focuses on the restoration and rehabilitation of our built heritage, and a member of the Arab Center for Architecture. Naji?
Hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Yasmin. All right. Actually, this presentation should be considered as part of a series of presentations that the BHI is organizing in the context of the reconstruction rehabilitation efforts that are being conducted now. It's been a year after the explosion of the port of Beirut on the 4th of August 2020. So I will be talking about the modern heritage to be considered as part of the general built heritage of the city and not isolated for whatever other reasons related to style or affiliation of taste, etc. My reading towards this period of time in the modern history of our city should be inscribed in the general understanding of the built heritage. All right. So we will be going through 5 chapters. An introduction that highlights the impact of the explosion that occurred 1 year ago on the city. Then we will be having this overview about the modern heritage according to 4 periods, or if you want to call them sub-periods, historical periods. 1925, 1935, that we call the interwar period, when we witnessed the integration of reinforced concrete in architecture. 1935, 1945 coincides with the independence of the modern Republic of Lebanon as we know it today, and during which we witness the French influence, namely Art Deco styles and affiliated styles and languages. 1945, 1955, after the independence, the post-independence period, during which we witnessed the work of architects and engineers who were actively taking part in the shaping of the city as we know it, or most of what we know of Beirut from that period. 1955, 1970, the mandate of Fuad Shahabism, and the entrepreneurial state, during which we witnessed the spread of modernism and the international style. I will start with a map that probably many of you have already seen, especially those who are taking part in the aftermath of the explosion. So it shows in red the silos that, or in red the storage hangar that exploded, and in black right next to it the silos of the port, the grain silos. And of course, you will see that the closer we are to the port, the harsher the damage and the more extreme the damage. So in red, the most affected areas, and then it goes decreasing until the blue belt in the map. And these areas in red and in yellow, mainly composed of the neighborhoods of Jemaise, Mar Mkhayel, Jaitewe, constitute a kind of hill facing the port. So not only there is a proximity in distance, but also topographically speaking, the effect of the explosion kind of was exaggerated due to that notion of the topography. Further down in yellow is the Shar al-Malik axis, or if you want, the Ashrafi Hill, Saint Nicolas, and part of Jaitewe, where also a lot of damage was observed. And when we talk about the damage, we don't differentiate periods of time. You know, the city has taken this blast in a massive way, and the damages touched all the buildings. Of course, the buildings belonging to the traditional period were affected much more than the modern buildings. In green is the third, if you want, the third radius, and these are the areas of Leblat, Mazra'a, and further down near Karm al-Zaytoun, Sufi area. And in blue, a more spread area along Damascus Road, Ras al-Naba, beginning of Hamra Antari, etc. And further north and northeast is the area of Karantina that has also witnessed a lot of damage, and it's seen here partially in yellow and in green. So these are a few photographs of the taken a few weeks after the blast. Here we recognize Armenia Street, or the axis of Mar Mkhayel, where you can see that the damages have affected the entire structure, urban structure, and of course has severely affected the social fabric, as we all know today. Another photograph in Pharaon Street, where you can see that parts were already under renovation. Here we were working in Mar Mkhayel on a cluster of buildings in collaboration with the AUB Neighborhood Initiative. And I also took part with BBHR and Absad. I took part in the surveying and the assessment of damaged neighborhoods. With the Arab Center for Architecture, we also organized targeted tours to highlight certain aspects for the NGOs that were offering their help to the inhabitants to rehabilitate their buildings. And this was crucial because many people found themselves in a situation where they couldn't really tell what to do, how to, what is the priority, etc. And the efforts of the BHI are inscribed in this logic of providing the inhabitants of Beirut regardless of their, their profession or their social status, etc., providing them with the necessary guidance for the rehabilitation works. Okay, so just before I start, this is an overview of what we call the modern heritage, and of course, the modern heritage did not start on a specific date with a specific type of buildings. It is inscribed in a sort of continuity with what preceded, and mainly the main concern I have when we talk about heritage is not to isolate specific buildings or monuments, but on the contrary, to always inscribe it in the urban fabric. So we're going to start with 1925, 1935, the interwar period, or in French, l'entre-deux-guerres, where I will be describing Beirut at that time as a garden city. And then we're going to see how the central hall typology persisted in the examples and in the buildings that were built during that period. And we're going to witness the beginning of the reinforced concrete, the integration of that new material in the architecture. The maps I'm using are taken from AUB library, from the Jaffet library. Probably many of you have worked on these maps. They are quite informative and rich in terms of the historical reading of the city and understanding of our present situation. So, so you can see here in red the let's say scope of the city, of the built, of the figure ground of the city, and you can notice as you go south, east, and west how the density diminishes and integrates or intertwines with the natural or the agricultural usage of the land. And this garden city was connected to its to the hinterland, to other cities, by means of main roads and arteries. And what I'm showing in blue here are the tramway lines. So it's important to always understand how the city is connected, how the territory is connected, and how this network is actually generating the growth of the city. So we can easily identify here that along these main arteries, the progression of the city is taking place. In the blue dot here is the main tramway station. These are a few photographs of, on the left, Damascus Road, and you can tell that the city is growing in that direction. You can recognize a few buildings that are erected on the periphery of that road. In the middle, in the center, the same area, a recent photograph, where we can still read the mountains in the background. And on the right, Armenia Street, or Mar Mikhail. This is taken like 10 years ago, where you can also read the alignment of the built fabric with regard to this important road connecting Beirut to the north. So if we take a closer look at the map, this is for those who are familiar with that area. You can see the horse track, the Pine Residence, and in blue, the tramway line, which ended at the beginning of Furnace Shabik, of nowadays Furnace Shabik, on Damascus Road. And you can see in the red dots the imprint of buildings. You can see how scarce is the density. But nevertheless, we really read the consequence of those important arteries on the implantation of the buildings. So simultaneously, we have surveyed several houses belonging to that period, which relation with the urban fabric is mainly that of an intimate connection to a garden. So you can see here a few examples in Mar Mikhail and Jaitawi. In Furnace Shabik. So you see that you see the prominence of the central hall typology in all its variations, and the importance of that house opening onto a garden. So the relation between the house and the street was not yet very strong, and we can talk about a loose fabric and villas and houses organized along their gardens. I will be showing all along the presentation some examples surveyed by my students at the American University of Beirut in the context of the workshop Surveying Regional Architecture. So here it's a house in Jaitawi. In gray, I highlighted the footprint of the house, and in green, its garden. Of course, the central hall was still oriented north to maximize daylight, minimize sun exposure, etc. All the characteristics of the late Ottoman period were still used and applied in this period. Here you can see the floor plans and the strong presence of the central hall and the organization of the house along that central hall. The north facade on the right side and the east facade, sorry, and the west facade on the left, where you recognize the scale of these houses, 2 floors, 12 meters high, all the ingredients of the pre-modern period were still applied here, but you will notice that, for example, the columns carrying the balcony are in concrete, the balcony slabs are in concrete, so we notice the importance of the concrete that is starting to integrate in these houses. On the left, some of you would recognize the Corum Tower facing the French Lycée. The Corum family owned the agents, were the agents of the Ford brand, the car American brand Ford, and they erected this this building to house the showroom and other amenities, and we can clearly read the resemblance with the early 20th century towers in New York, of course at a different scale. On the right, you can see it in the context of that part of the city. And in the foreground, we recognize the French lycée under construction. So actually, the concrete is used for its ability to for its ease in the execution, the flexibility of applying several molds on the balustrades, column elements, capital, base, etc. You can see it here in those examples. In the building on the left, we see that this is a strong continuation of the central hall house, but it's a new version in terms of the materiality. But in terms of the proportion, the organization of the space, it is quite similar to what we've seen in the turn of the century, with an important difference is that the concrete will allow bigger balconies. They become like covered living spaces, which, by the way, emphasizes the importance of the garden. Between the house and the rest of the fabric, there is this garden that is used at ground level and that we are overlooking when we are on the first level. Another aspect that I want to highlight that the concrete will allow as well is the densification. So the addition of an upper floor. You see in the middle photograph the stairs leading to an upper floor, and on the example on the right as well. The concrete also allows these cantilevers using corbels, concrete corbels. You see them here on the right side. In general, concrete allows for flexibility, for ease in the execution and the construction, and allows to densify, to increase the living space by adding additional floors while respecting the general proportion between the house and the garden. And at the same time, by replicating what was executed or built earlier with sandstone, by replicating it here in concrete. These are other examples of the integration of the concrete in these houses. And in some cases, like it is the case here on the right side, the balcony, the covered balcony, actually operates as a cover for the entrance of the building, which is an interesting solution. Concrete also is used to cover the facade as a finishing material. So plaster becomes cement-based plaster. You can see here in these two examples from the area of Mar Mikhail how this new material allows to create a texture, a pattern, and technically these solutions would allow also for the plaster to avoid, you would avoid the problems that you could face when applying a plaster on an entire surface without any joints, where you would encounter cracks and other expansion constraints. So here the pattern, the hexagonal motif that you see here allows for that. And in many cases, when I see some houses being refurbished or restored, people nowadays are simply removing that skin, that finishing layer, And I believe it should be preserved and restored because it expresses a certain period and a certain know-how of the history of our local architecture. I will show also a few examples where concrete is actually visible on the outer skin of the building, like it is the case on the upper left example. So you can see here that columns and beams constitute a grid that is clearly expressed on the facade. And I think that when they renovated this building, they used the difference in color to emphasize this relation, which is a good in favor of that reading that we can do of that building. So we will be seeing later on the floor plans of this building in Mar Mikhail that I'm sure many of you know. It's on the main Armenia Street, and it has this particular round corner that takes the corner of the plot. The two other examples are also a later period of the use of concrete, whereby you see that the balcony has on the right side image, you see that the balcony slab has a kind of a corbel that spreads on the entire length of the balcony and increases as we go towards the facade wall. The triple opening of the inherited central hall. And you notice the balcony, these few openings in the balcony parapet that allow proper ventilation of these spaces. On the bottom left is an interesting example as well of a free form curved outline that these loggias are taking. It's in Jaitawi as well on the Khazinain Street. Also applying these slits that allow these loggias to be properly ventilated. These three examples show the notion of density, of superimposing several floors. We can start talking about a typical floor even in these cases. Regardless of the exact date of construction, these buildings in the Farn al-Hayek area demonstrate the variety that the concrete is bringing to the Beiruti building and to the architectural scene. More to the right, you see it's the Sursok building. Actually, the ground level is truncated by the fence, so you can imagine here a ground level with a few shops. So many of these buildings start having a commercial ground level as well. Okay, so these are the floor plans of the Sursok building. You notice the impressive scale of the central hall. You see that the presence of the staircase is integrated in a way to offer a proper distribution to the house without disrupting the main spaces. You can notice the grid of the structure. We can read it in several locations where you see there's you can identify an additional thickness or the columns, etc. All of these elements are made of reinforced concrete. The elevation shows the prominence, the persistence of the central hall, like we said earlier, we see the commercial ground level, and we see an elaborate wrought iron work of the balustrades. And again, remember that the concrete here, despite the drastic change in construction techniques, still imitates or adopts the elements that were known to the builders when these houses were built with stone. The Mar Mikhail corner building, where the grid of the columns is very clear. It organizes the space. All the columns are connected with drop beams. Quite impressive. This building belongs to the Maronite community. The Maronites built around the EDL site that we know today, built several housing projects, and this is one of them. All right, so so the concrete not only punctuates the space, but also is the main composing element of the facade, in which between the columns, the pillars, and the slabs, we inscribe the openings having the same proportions, the elongated proportions that we know or that we inherited from the Beiruti house. Moving on to the second period that we entitled the Independence period, marked, of course, by the French Mandate, and during which, as I mentioned earlier, we witnessed the strong influence of European styles like the Art Deco and even in some instances Art Nouveau patterns and motifs. So we're gonna talk about the expansion of the city. We're gonna talk about what I call the Transitional Plan, and we're gonna see a few examples of this Art Deco influence. So in the 40s, Beirut was still expanding along its main arteries, but we notice in the map here in black these installations of the French army, of the French mandate military regiments. And I could venture and say that these installations are kind of surrounding the city from east to south to the west. And of course, we have to mention that during that period, the port was, in the port of Beirut was undergoing a process of modernization as well. So in blue, I'm showing here the main arteries that in a decade or two previously were the tramway lines. Today they become the main arteries, the car or automobile roads connecting Beirut to its surroundings, and connecting the main infrastructure and installation, like the port, the train station, the airport, are the railway tracks that I'm showing here in yellow. And remember these main arteries, because in the next period, these will become main boulevards and avenues connecting the different neighborhoods of the city. So Beirut was expanding still along its outskirts, along these main arteries. So on the south you have Fern al-Shabak, on the east you have Karantina and Burj Hamoud, on the west you have Ras al-Naba and Hamra, And this progression of the urban fabric also will be accompanied by a progression in the architectural typology of the built layer. This is a colored black and white colored photograph of the city with in the foreground the port of Beirut, and we see the scope of extension or of expansion of the city. The military barracks of the French with, of course, the use of reinforced concrete, but following a certain, let's say, classicism in the volumetric expression, in the proportions of the openings, corresponding to the techniques of construction of that period. So this is the Quartier Franchet d'Espéry in Badaro that will become later on and still standing nowadays as a series of educational institutions and schools. So you can see them here on the left, Lycée du Musée. In the middle, this is a school in Jaitawi. And on the right side, a residential building in Ras Al Naba, adopting the same expression and materiality of what was being used during that period, namely concrete, adopting certain motifs in the balustrades, in the structural elements like the columns, the pillars, etc. Moving on to what I call the transitional plan, important aspect of a shift in the layout of the typical Beiruti house. It's a house that we surveyed in Ras Al Naba area. It's a humble structure, actually, like many of that period, because the outskirts, as I mentioned earlier, the outskirts of the city were occupied by houses that became 2 to 3 floors, 2 to 3 story buildings. But through these few examples, we will see how the shift is happening in the social habits versus the layout of the typical layout of the house. So this is Muhammad Hood Street on the left, and in black, the Harati building that we surveyed. So many of you are familiar with these examples found around in the outskirts of the old city, where engineers and architects started experimenting with, curved shapes, whatever the concrete, the new material had to offer in terms of flexibility of the execution and the, between brackets, modernity of certain volumes under the influence of certain European examples. So the Harati building is on the right side of the slide with this elongated balcony, and on the left, 2 other examples in the nearby area. Okay, so what are we looking at here is a 3-bedroom apartment with amenities, living space, etc. And you recognize the massive staircase connecting the floors. Of course, you have to note that the ceiling, floor to ceiling height is still a generous dimension, 3.5 to 3.8 meters, sorry. Hence the length of the stair flight. But more importantly is the presence of this living space, living or reception dining space, elongated, just like in the old typology of the central hall. Notice the living room on the side, and I'll explain it later. I'll try to give an explanation, of course. And then we have this serving corridor and the different functions connecting to it, the kitchen and service area, and the bedroom sleeping area with its bathroom. So what happens here is that we are in a different mode. We are separating the private from the public. We are no longer distributing the different rooms from the central space. And this is an important change that will go on developing in the coming years with certain moments of awakening, I might say. So we will find some later examples with a more rigid centralized distribution. But this breaking of the plan according to the functions, which is a very modernist approach, will evolve to become the modern buildings that we know today. This is the facade. So, of course, the facade becomes asymmetrical. There is a kind of balance between the staircase volume and the rest of the building, which is the apartment itself, and then a balance between the elongated balcony and the frontal balcony, etc. Another example in the Jaitawi area of an individual house, one floor here, but that could have been 2 floors, by the way. And again, we're going to look at this organization of the space. So as I said earlier, high ceiling, hence the length of the stair flights, the importance of the structural grid, as you see it in plan, and the same observation about the, I might say, an asymmetrical central hall with a side living space, amenities, kitchen, etc., and the private area of the bedrooms. Now, concerning this lateral space in red, which is the side room, in many cases, it's a winter room where the family could stay, or a separate reception space away from the family space. So it's either or. It's not only separate for guests or winter for private use. It can be either or, depending on the social context in which we are. The elevations of this house, and you notice the visible structure in which we see the walls that are slightly recessed. A few examples showing Art Deco influences. I always consider that this should be put between brackets because it's not Art Deco buildings per se, but we notice a few elements like the striped columns, the geometric forms, whether here in the loggia or the triple opening, the high windows of the triple opening, etc. Again here, some examples of Art Deco influence. Okay, so the rigidity of the geometric form, the connecting vertical elements that are the columns expressed with these grooves that go vertical all along the building, and on the left side a more elaborate treatment, a kind of corniche, the on the part of the building, and more refined elements surrounding openings. All right. So the third sequence or period that I'm suggesting in this reading is the post-independence period, 1945, 1955, in which we will witness the densification of the city. Obviously, in this image, you see that we are talking about ground +5, ground +6 floors, a functionalist layout of the apartments, and we're gonna look at these buildings with the lens of the profession, meaning identifying the work of architects and engineers, and a couple of words about the zoning laws and regulations that were being established during that period, and that had a strong impact on the architecture and the urban fabric. So comparing to the previous maps, we see now that the expansion of the city here in dark green has reached nearly what we know of Beirut today, with the exception of course, a few neighborhoods that were still not urbanized. We notice the expansion of the port, which now has a second basin and a series of warehouses, and the network of railway connecting it to the Mar Mikhail station and to the NBT station further to the south. And in red, I'm in the southern part, some of the improvements, urban infrastructure that was taking place, mainly these boulevards. I think I have an issue in this slide, because we should be seeing also the peripheral one, the one that surrounds the Nahar, and then Corniche al-Mazra'a, and then reaches the Rawshi area. In any case, just a second, I have a problem. Sorry, Yasmin, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, just a second. I'm trying to resolve it. Okay, I don't know why. Okay, we're back. Okay, so in blue, these inherited main arteries from the tramway line to main roads connecting Beirut to the inland cities, Damascus, Saida, Tripoli. Today, we can these green and red new arteries that in different modes are preparing for the and at the same time you have to know that certain projects like the avenues around the Adaro area and the Palace of Justice today were also part of an observation by several politicians like Sami Salah, about the notion of allowing the armed forces to easily reach any uprising, any revolt, and counter it before it spreads further. Quite similar to what happens in the Haussmannian Paris, but at a smaller scale, of course. So in green, we see that this peripheral boulevard or corniche, we call it the corniche, is executed in segments and still incomplete. And in red, we see a series of roundabouts and main boulevards occurring in the southern part of the city, starting to echo the modern urbanism based on or built around the idea of rapid traffic, of large boulevards adapted to the automobile and to the new ways of communication and of transportation. So this would be a fair photograph to illustrate what was happening at that period, where we see a mix already in the built fabric of different periods of time. And at the same time, we see that the further areas in the nearby mountains or on the coastal area of Jdeide, etc., was not yet totally or urbanized and reached by the expanding city. And further to the west, this photograph shows the few buildings that were starting to emerge in the Rausche area. And these are, of course, buildings portraying or echoing the modern aspect of the architecture and of the city, like I mentioned earlier. So we're going to look at a few examples where, as I told you before, it's the typical floor plan of the apartment is starting to liberate itself from the presence of the central dar or the central hall. And in some cases, there is a kind of resistance to that. We will see it together. I wanted to mention here in this first example from Furnace Shabik area, you have to notice, and we will see other examples, the work of the plaster, again, with a certain grid. All right, it has a kind of bump that is applied all along the surface. Again, the same idea of controlling the expansion rates and the behavior of this material, of this finishing material, and at the same time creating something similar to the Tyrolean plaster, but at a different scale. It was a quest for innovation and for experimentation. And of course, these plastered areas were surrounded by smooth plaster, areas treated with smooth plaster, like the edge of the balcony, etc. Here you can see it maybe clearer on this photograph. So this is the plan of that building. So A and B are two different apartments. So before drawing that red line, one would think that it's a very long central hall, but then suddenly there's a wall in the middle, and these are actually two apartments, which is, of course, compared to the previous examples, seems a bit outrageous to us, because the magic of the central hall was its south-north orientation and the cross ventilation it offers, etc. Well, this is the drawback of this densification process and the commercial aspect of the development of apartment buildings intended for the rental. So A and B are two different apartments with still the presence of the central dar, split in two, by the way, as you notice here, with an internal door that would allow natural light to reach the inner part, and the distribution of the different functions around that central hall, but through what I call them service buffer areas or small corridors that you see here in number 7 in both cases. Okay, this is the elevation of that building. Another example along Damascus Road in the Badaro area, Badaro Adliye area. And the two buildings are really a good testimony of that period. The first one, you identify two identical blocks with served by a central staircase. And during that period, the idea of the staircase pressed very often volumetrically, and it operates as a light well in the building. So a lot of glass along these stairs. And you notice that right and left to the stairs, you identify a triple opening here that would eventually be the living space. So you see how scaling and densifying this inherited city creates new typologies, but there are constants like the ones we are encountering now. Also, you can identify the finishing with the plaster, and the plaster has a kind of grid, a kind of geometric subdivision, again, that would allow it to sustain that area without cracking or without expanding or shrinking beyond the joints or the grooves created by that grid. On the left, a freer plan, a freer layout, and a balcony. We do not have the survey of these buildings, but it's interesting to identify here in that second example, or to notice that the floor plan has totally shifted to something very asymmetrical, and I would venture and say that this is a layout that responds to separation of public-private, bedrooms and living space, etc., etc. A building in the Ras Al Naba area by architect Saeed Hajel. It's the Saidi building. So here we're gonna look at the floor plan, but before that, I invite you to read these buildings in terms of proportions between mass and void, and how this is taken to a certain harmony and balance, that even when we have a very long balcony, the actual openings giving onto that balcony would still respect a very conservative proportion between the opening and the wall. This is the floor plan of that building. So again, the presence of the structure, the importance of the stairs as they still allow an important floor-to-ceiling height between floors, and not surprisingly for us, because we've already seen it before, a kind of separation between the living space and the sleeping space, and the amenities, kitchen and bathroom, or guest bathroom or service bathroom, connected by a corridor. The introduction of this corridor is sometimes making these plans quite elongated, and some architects like Said Hajel take advantage of that proportion to express it also in the length of the balconies. And what I like in this plan is these are the balconies, okay, is the fact that you can actually create a closed loop connecting. So the balcony suddenly connects private and the public. And I find this quite interesting. I lived in an apartment like that, and it's really rewarding to have the ability to move freely in the house without feeling that you have reached a dead end. Okay, this is the elevation of that building. So one thing I want to highlight is the clarity of the intention, of the volumetric intention, as I said earlier. So notice how the flower box actually is suspended on the balcony, and it is read as a different element and not integrated with the balcony itself. So if I go back to the photograph, you will see it here. You see how subtle this detail is. Actually, it contributes in sustaining the proportions and the elegance of the length of the linear element that is the balcony. And in some cases nowadays we lose somehow this hierarchy in the volumetric reading. Another example by the same architect, and you notice here the same features that I mentioned earlier: proportions of mass and void, grid of the plasterwork, framing the windows. By the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but the use of concrete here is still used to the benefit of the performance of the building. So notice how the windows are protected with this concrete frame that allows for the shutter, this projecting shutter, to operate within a legible frame. Notice the linearity of the balcony and the flower box I mentioned earlier. I will not extend a lot, okay, the minute detailing of the cornices on the top, the framing of certain volumes. All of this contributes in, despite the densification and moving on to a different scale of buildings, the work of this architect sustains the residential aspect and the proportion and the scale of the building. So in the next examples, I will show some buildings that are definitely the work of engineers and architects. I chose on purpose not to name or mention any, because then it would be unfair and the list would be too long. So these are in the area of Badaro. Okay. So similar observations as the one we did before. So asymmetry. So notice balcony versus mass is creating a kind of asymmetrical facade, but that is balanced at the same time, because we understand that this is the outdoor space offered for the apartment, etc. Compare the building on the left with the building on the right. This is something I will not develop a lot, but here we can recognize through the materiality of the building, we can try to at least say which one is newer. So whenever you have wood shutters, it would mean that this is an older building compared to the one to the right, where you have steel frames for the window and no wooden shutters at all. Okay. And notice the very delicate and sensitive work of the balustrades I argue that the steel work or the iron work in terms of the balustrade or the limitation of these balconies would offer a lot of transparency and would sustain the ventilation, proper ventilation of these spaces. On the building on the left, you notice the presence, the clarity of the structure with this round column on the corner. All right. Another example where we see the use of ceramic tiles, colored ceramic tiles on the balcony parapets. This will be used more and more as we move on towards this modern period. In this case, there is an alternation of the colors that I find interesting. It creates a certain rhythm. It breaks the scale of the building. This is one apartment, by the way. We're going to look at the floor plan later on. You notice also a pilotis or the pilotis floor on the image on the left. We'll discuss this also later on. What I also want to highlight in these buildings is the clarity also of the structure. So you see the columns and the drop beams on the ground level carrying the building and constituting the elements support, like constituting the pilotis floor is not only columns, but also columns and beams combined together. And it's emphasized by these beams that are reaching the outer edge of the facade. So this is the floor plan of this building, taken also from AUB students' work in the context of a vertical studio. So I'm showing you this plan to again underline the importance and the central position of the living room, also with its lateral smaller sitting area. You see it here on the right, bottom right. So, and all this, the public separated from the private, here expressed in beige, which are the bedrooms. And I find it weird that the balcony is split in two like this, but probably it's a choice maybe of the owner, probably of the architect. I don't really know, but it's a bit misleading when you look at the building from the outside. But at the same time, it's coherent in plan because each of these rooms, only one doesn't have a balcony, and the main balcony for the living room. This is in Ain Lemreise on the Corniche. So also a residential building, but with smaller size apartments, probably with the proximity to the American University. These were intended probably for professors or students for rent. The particularity of this building is the total liberation of the facade through this two-dimensional grid that you see, and at the same time, a very elongated layout organized along a common corridor that you see here, articulating two apartments. All right, so 3 bedrooms, but humble sizes of living, dining areas. Okay, and of course, now we are no longer in the pattern of any persistence of any trace of the central hall, but what is particular here are the living dining areas that are on the extremity of the plan, right here on the right side and on the left side. the building faces the corniche, hence the sea, hence the you know, this grid and the repetitive module that opens up to the sea. And on the back side, it's the Dar el Mreisi street. You see how the building adapts to the urban situation, and this geometric distortion is taken by the stairs, by the main stairs, and in the apartments by the service areas. Okay, so you see here the two living dining spaces for each apartment. In section, we see that this building used to be connected directly to the shoreline before the execution or the construction of the Corniche Boulevard or Avenue de Paris. So interestingly, you see how the structure really expresses the stacking of typical floors, and you recognize the interesting treatment on the ground level and how it connects to the context, whether on the sea side or on the entrance side. This is the main facade. It's oriented north, of course, luckily, so a lot of light and maximum sea view. A few photographs of the internal common stairs, building staircase, and you see the geometric adaptation, and the two other photographs showing the views to the sea and the view to the Dar el Mreisi neighborhood through the grid of the facades. We have to mention a few important regulations and laws that were issued during that period. I will name a few of them to give you an idea about what caused at the same time this, what allowed this densification to occur, this stacking of the floors, this expression in the verticality. So between 1940 and the mid-1950s, there was a law that abolished the limitation in height and of 26-meter height, and created a regulation for buildings reaching 40 meters high. There was the possibility of building a pilotis floor, and we've seen several ones previously in the previous slides. There was, under the Ecochar planning, what we call the zoning. So there are exploitation factors that govern the density in the footprint and in the built-up area. And more importantly, we will see later on, the merger of parcels was allowed. So we will witness a change in scale of the urban fabric. Okay, here this is in the Ashrafi Marn Oula or Saint Nicolas neighborhood, where you see the contrast between the turn of the century buildings with the pitched roof and the modern city that grew in between. Okay, on the left in Badaro, we have the setbacks that create these interesting cavities or space corridors between buildings. The pilotis floor that allows transparency at ground level. Unfortunately, in the regulations, it was used as a parking area, but whenever the pilotis remained pedestrian and allowed the access to the building itself, these spaces are very interesting. And on the right, we see the impact of the gabarit or the envelope on the profile of the buildings. The last period, chapter, Shahabism and the entrepreneurial state. On the right, I'm suggesting to look at this period here through the Shar al-Halo, the massive Shar al-Halo station project. And the Shahab period or mandate was marked by the strong presence of the state and witnessed several reforms in the administration and in the construction of a modern state in all its, in all its agencies, whether cultural, educational, in terms of infrastructure, industrial, etc. So we're going to look at the notion of Greater Beirut or Beirut al-Kubra in Arabic. We will witness the spread of what we call the international style, led by, again, engineers and architects, and how the merger of parcels, the setbacks, the sanitation rules are also changing the architectural typology. The map of the Greater Beirut that we see here is from the 1963 Plan Directeur, and it indicates on the right side in a sketch the preliminary limits in dash dot line, okay, from Dbaye to Khalde, or from Nahr al-Kalb to Khalde, and in a more continuous line further to the east, the natural limits imposed by the topography. Now I'm in Baghdad, so I'm on the edge, if you want, of the Greater Beirut. And nowadays there is this highway that connects Beirut to the Matan, which is the Matan Express Highway. So we are somehow 50 years later living in what was conceived back then as the Grand Beirut or the Greater Beirut, or the metropolitan scale of the city. So most of you are familiar with that scale of Beirut and how it spreads and how it connects to this new geography, and how it alters many of the natural and pre-established elements of the pre-modern city. So during that period, okay, they call it the Golden Age. So Lebanon witnessed a flux of capital, of Gulf businessmen and companies establishing in Beirut, important hotels and other touristic infrastructure established around the city. Here we see on the left the Quartier des Hôtels, or the famous hotel district, and on the right image one of these hotels at the scale of the Beirut of the 1960s, the Alcazar Hotel, with its grid on the facade that you see here. So the work of several architects who were famous back then, like Joseph Philippe Karam and other architects and engineers. Here we are on the Corniche side, on the Rausche area. We see the Shams building with its colored motifs on the facades. On the right side here, the Shell building by Shayer, and on the left, other buildings in the Rausche area. And we totally are under the influence of the international style and the work of these architects that implementing and developing this new style. The elements of this architecture are the same ones as the same modernist international style, which are the rational structure, the visible structure, the stacking of floor, the use of glass. But in Beirut and other cities of the Mediterranean, there was an adaptation to the local context, whether the adaptation to the climate or to the techniques of construction. Here are a few examples in Badaro where you will see several variations on the same theme of the expression of the structure, the stacking of the slabs, so vertical versus horizontal, and here the elements that play a role in the climate control, like the shading elements, come into play to allow these architects to, to experiment and add more elements that would break down the scale of the building and at the same time allow for shading. So not only the depth of balcony creates shades, but also these suspended horizontal concrete elements also play a role, or in the top canopy that you see here on the left, and the concrete openings creating a kind of concrete pergola also create shading for the last balcony. A few other examples taken from Ras Al Naba. So the stacking of floors in certain cases was also broken down into stacking of volumes as well. So not only the floor itself is expressed, but within the same floor, we notice the expression of a linear element that combines, for example, living and dining. All right, and certain architects really reached a level of I might say manierism, whereby these elements were emphasized and sometimes exaggerated. Notice that the glass also is used extensively to counterbalance the play of mass and void, like in this example on the left. On the right, we can see the use of concrete modular prefabricated elements here serving as a sunscreen that we call also claustra. And further in the 60s and the early 70s, we notice a kind of let's say reduction of the of the notes or of the elements. So on the left here, this is in Badaro, typical of the late 60s, early 70s, with the aluminum railing on the balcony and quite minimalistic expression of the architectural elements, balconies, a blank wall, and that's all. And on the right side, an office building, all right? So in Beirut, of course, and in the outskirts, Beirut became a busy town with a lot of migration happening from the outskirts and the towns and villages. Everyone was working in Beirut, so office space was extensively a program that was repeated and extended in the areas of Hamra, Badaro, Ashrafi, etc. So here we recognize one of these buildings. So absence of balconies, absence of any, relief on the facade, with a totally glazed facade. And the last element I wanted to show is a different scale that occurs in the late 70s, late 60s, sorry, early 70s, with, as I told you earlier, the liberation of the height of buildings. So here it's an example in Ashrafi where it becomes comparable to a tower, a high building, I mean, a totally different scale from what we've seen until now. And what is amusing is the persistence of the, you know, the intervention of individual apartments, adding curtains and lately adding glass to close those balconies, unfortunately. So I wanted to end with this example that opens up to the forthcoming stages of the more contemporary example. Thank you.
Thank you, Naji. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I hope I wasn't too long.
No, it's okay.
It's okay.
Okay, great.
So we have
the
first
first
question.
question.
Can you hear me okay?
Hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So the first question from Huda, it's in French, but I translated it in English. So do we know when the triple arches were transformed into a central bay and when these arches or bay disappeared from our architecture?
Actually, as I mentioned it earlier, there isn't a specific date. There are steps forward and sometimes a few steps backwards when it comes to adopting a certain language or a certain solution. But we know that in the late 30s, the triple arches as we know them, or the late 20s, sorry, the triple arches as we know them started to disappear to the advantage of more geometric openings and sometimes only one single opening and no longer a rhythm of three. So, but I couldn't give specific dates. It's more, it's like a relay in French. So the triple opening gave room to a wider opening, but it's not rigid. It's not fixed. I don't know if I answered the question.
And when did they disappear exactly, this sort of triple opening or big opening?
Again, I couldn't give a specific date, but as you saw, in the 40s, late 40s, we started leaving behind the prominence of the space of the central dar or of the main dar. I think we should look more, instead of the shape of the opening on the facade, we should look further into the configuration of the plan. And then I think the answer is easier. So the moment you start seeing plans that adopt a freer layout, an asymmetrical separation of function, etc., despite the persistence of a main living space, you won't have anymore a triple opening or even a large opening. So again, I mean, I tried in the presentation to say that it's a process. it's an evolution. It's not the abolition of a type and then the creation of a new type.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
You showed us at the beginning a mapping done with BBHR. Does this mapping include modern heritage?
The BBHR was focusing on a certain period, so pre-modern, but with the same map was used with the Arab Center for Architecture, and there was a mapping done on modern architecture. Yes.
Is this modern architecture endangered like the traditional architecture?
Okay, so two answers. Before the explosion, I would have answered it's not. In modern architecture is not as endangered as traditional heritage. But after the explosion, there is a reverse phenomena that is taking place. A lot of importance is, of course, given to the traditional fabric, and not enough information or not enough mapping and research is done on modern heritage. So what I'm afraid of is that the blast or the explosion will increase the gap in terms of attention between the traditional and the modern. Whereas, in my opinion, there is a continuity. As I showed you today in my presentation, there is a continuity. You would really have a hard time drawing the limit between what is traditional and what is early modern or late modern or modernist or international style. It's a succession of periods that imposes on us to take care and to pay attention and to protect equally the traditional and the modern. But to answer you, I think today both are endangered.
Okay, thank you. There are messages from Jala Makhzoumi, Maya Hmaiden, and Abdel Halim Jabr that are thanking you for this very nice presentation, very comprehensive presentation.
Thank you, Jala, Abdel Halim,
Maya.
And Maya. Thank you. Thank you. With Jala, we discovered a lot in Jaitewe. I remember, I don't know if she remembers, but we discovered a lot about the importance of the garden and how it is essential to these houses.
So thank you, Naji. That's it for today.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, everyone, for your patience, and looking forward to the forthcoming presentations.
Yes, the next presentation will be about structural disorders, and it's this Friday. So we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you all.